This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Monday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Before we get into today's video, I want to thank my patrons for helping me get a sweet new microphone, which you can see here. It should sound way better than what it sounded like on my channel for years. My old microphone started to go out on me last week, so I apologize for the sound in last week's videos, but now things will sound much better. If you're interested in being a patron to help me improve the quality of my content with things like microphone purchases, or just to give back, you can find a link in the description. Alright, now on with your regularly scheduled MTG Top 10. One thing I want to do with this series is eventually get around to doing every single mechanic and keyword ability, and I've done more than 50 of them so far, but there's still plenty to go. With Modern Horizons 2, we've seen the return of a lot of different mechanics, and one of them is Vanishing. That's what made me want to do today's video, which looks at both Fading and Vanishing. These mechanics are not identical, but they're pretty darn close. Fading is the older mechanic. A permanent with Fading enters with a number of counters equal to its Fading value. You remove one of them every turn, but when you get to a turn where you have no counters to remove, you sacrifice the creature. Fading only ever appeared in 2000's Nemesis. Then, a few years later, in 2006 to 2007's Time Spiral block, Vanishing made its debut. Vanishing was intentionally designed to be a more intuitive version of Fading, and as a result, it isn't that different. The key difference is just that once your creature is out of counters, it gets sacrificed. Vanishing certainly is more intuitive. With Fading, it's kind of weird that removing the last counter doesn't actually do anything, whereas with Vanishing, it does. Still, while Vanishing is more intuitive, the irony here is that players who go back and play with cards that have Fading are even less likely to understand how it works, since they're likely to just assume it's like Vanishing. Anyway, that's the reason why I decided to include both of these mechanics together. Vanishing and Fading aren't very different from one another. Obviously, both of these mechanics are pure downside, but like with other downside mechanics, they designed some interesting cards that manage to be good anyway. This is because the permanents have powerful enough effects that the fact that you're going to eventually lose them isn't the end of the world. In all, there are 34 cards with Fading and Vanishing, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before I get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A top 8 at a Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, Mythic Invitational, Legacy, or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a top 8 at a Magic Fest or Grand Prix is worth 1 point. At number 10, it is Parallax Tide. It's part of a cycle of Fading enchantments and Nemesis, all of which can remove Fading counters for some type of effect, and that effect ends when the enchantment leaves the battlefield. Making it so that permanents with Fading can cash in their counters for value is actually a pretty cool design, as it lets you do something more powerful in exchange for the effect not lasting as long, and that's an interesting decision to have players make. In the case of Parallax Tide, it can exile lands. This means that you can have it come down and immediately exile up to 5 lands to have them be out of the way until your next turn, and obviously, you can choose a value less than 5/2 to have the effect last longer. That's a pretty good way to make your opponent fall behind, and sometimes this type of effect almost feels like Time Walk. In Standard, it saw play in a pretty sweet deck that ran a bunch of enchantments, and Opalescence and Replenish were the big payoffs for this. With Opalescence in play, Parallax Tide was not only able to disrupt the opponent's mana, it was also a 4-mana 4/4. With Replenish, you could also easily get back your Parallax Tide and reset it. What's more is, the deck could permanently deprive the opponent of lands by comboing Opalescence, Parallax Tide, and Parallax Wave. With the Wave already in play, you could play the Tide and exile 5 lands. Then, with that effect on the stack, you would exile the Tide using the Wave. This would cause the 5 lands to be lost forever. Obviously, that's pretty powerful. It also gained a single point in an extended, blue-white mid-range deck. At number 9, it is Woodripper. While a lot of Fading creatures have really awesome stats, Woodrippers are merely okay. However, it does get significant value out of the fact that it can cash in Fading counters to destroy artifacts. If your opponent has enough of them, the Ripper can end up being a 3-for-1. There were enough artifacts in the Extended of 2000 that Mono-Black Reanimator decks ran a singleton Woodripper in the sideboard. Once they sided it in, they could stick it in the graveyard with Entomb and reanimate it to take full advantage of the ability. At number 8, it is Defender on Vec, another fairly unimpressive creature based on stats alone. Like Woodripper though, it is able to remove Fading counters for an effect. In this case, each Fading counter removed can prevent 2 damage done to a creature or player. Defender Onvek gained all of its points in Rebels decks and Masks block constructed. That format was almost exclusively Rebel decks, and it was a pretty good sideboard card for the mirror, as it would basically guarantee you would win combat if it was in play, as your opponent's creatures having equal stats to your creatures would no longer be the case. At number 7, it is Keldon Marauders, the first card on the list with Vanishing. This 2-mana 3/3 does 1 damage to a player when it comes down, and another damage when it leaves the battlefield. With its impressive stats, Keldon Marauders often amounts to 5 damage for only 2 mana, and that's the kind of rate that red decks tend to be very interested in. And even if it can't attack, it has a fail case of doing 2 damage, which is acceptable. Unsurprisingly, Keldon Marauders was played in red aggro decks while it was in standard. At number 6, it is Ancient Hydra, a card that might not seem like much to us today. I mean, it's a 5-mana 5/1 with the downside of fading, and yeah, that is kind of rough, but being able to turn those fading counters into damage against anything is pretty nice. The Hydra can easily give you a 2-for-1 thanks to that ability. What's more is, while it was in standard, fading creatures got some extra power thanks to Fires of Yavimaya. Giving your whole board haste meant that fading creatures could get an additional attack in before fading out of existence. And a 5/1 with haste that your opponent isn't expecting is pretty nice, especially with all the other value it gives you. All 6 of Ancient Hydra's points in standard came at Pro Tour Chicago in 2000, where it was in 3 Fires of Yavimaya decks that made the top 8. At number 5, it is Aven Riftwatcher, another creature with Vanishing, and one that's pretty similar to Keldon Marauders. Both are fairly efficient, have Vanishing, and do something both when they enter and leave the battlefield. The Riftwatcher is a 3-mana 2/3 flyer that gains you 2 life with each of its triggers. The Riftwatcher isn't quite as good as the later card Kitchen Finks, but I think the comparison will help you understand what made the Riftwatcher good. It really destroyed aggro decks, because it could gain you a whopping 4 life while also trading with one of their cards, and that's a pretty big speed bump for hyper-aggressive decks. While it had some modest success as a sideboard card in Time Spiral block constructed, it found the most success in Reveillark decks in Standard. These decks played a bunch of creatures that Reveillark could reanimate, and most of them had enter the battlefield triggers that gave you serious value, and that of course includes Aven Riftwatcher. In fact, in that deck, the fact that the Riftwatcher ultimately vanished wasn't even all downside, since if you needed more life, you could just reanimate it again. At number 4, it is Saproling Burst, which is part of the same cycle as Parallax Wave. In this case, removing fading counters makes Saproling tokens. You can use the burst to just make one big token that'll be around for a while, or you can make a bunch of them if that will help you win the game. Like some of the other cards on this list, it was played in standard Fires of Yavimaya decks. With Fires in play, you can make that beefy token or an army of tokens attack right away, and that significantly reduces the downside of fading. Saproling Burst is kind of a weird card because it's the only card in the game that makes Saproling tokens that aren't just 1/1s. It has its own special kind of Saproling token. At number 3, it is Blastoderm. Even by today's standards, Blastoderm has some pretty impressive stats. A 4-mana 5/5 with Shroud is no joke. You're basically only going to be able to take it down in combat, and that's not going to be easy because it's a 5/5. And sure, it does have fading, but it has high enough fading that the downside here is well worth it. Remember, even with fading, this will be attacking 3 times, and that's plenty. Like Saproling Burst and Ancient Hydra, Blastoderm gained most of its points in Fires of Yavimaya decks in Standard. However, it did have a few other homes. It also gained points in the Masks block Rebels deck and in Standard Naya aggro decks. At number 2, it is Parallax Wave, which I mentioned earlier. It's another card from the same cycle as Parallax Tide and Saproling Burst. Parallax Wave can exile creatures by removing its fading counters. This means that it can come down and sometimes feel like a one-sided board wipe that just wins you the game. You can also choose to use it a little more conservatively, to get rid of 1 or 2 problem creatures for much longer. In block and standard, it was played in Rebel decks. It was also played alongside Parallax Tide in Replenish Opalescence decks where, as I noted earlier, it could enable a combo with the Tide that let you get rid of lands permanently. In addition to that, it could also just combo with Opalescence on its own. You could have it come down, exile 4 creatures with it, and with those exiles on the stack, use the wave to exile itself, and those creatures would be gone forever. Parallax Wave also saw some play in white aggro decks in Extended. And at number 1, it is Tanglewire, which has 61 more points than Parallax Wave, so there wasn't much of a contest for the number 1 slot on this list. Tanglewire is a prison card that forces players to tap down an artifact, creature, or land for every fading counter on the wire. Now, the effect is sort of symmetrical, but whoever plays the Tanglewire is affected by it a lot less. Once you play it, your opponent has to tap down 4 things on their next turn, but on your next turn, you only have to tap down 3, and one of them can be Tanglewire itself. And obviously, tapping down the wire isn't a real cost. So while it might seem symmetrical, it doesn't play out that way. Whoever plays Tangle Wire will come out way ahead. In Standard and Extended, it was played in Tinker decks, which could search up Tangle Wire at will, which is pretty nice, because when the situation is right, Tangle Wire can be insane. Tinker decks could also sacrifice the Tangle Wire once it had outlived its usefulness to get something else. However, Tangle Wire has been at its best in Vintage, where it's amassed an impressive 62 points. It's been played in a few different decks there over the years. At first, it was mostly played in Stacks, which was basically a deck that was a collection of prison artifacts like the Wire and Smokestack. Obviously, the deck running those cards was much less affected by them, partly because it ran a bunch of artifacts that you could tap without any real effect, and because Smokestack itself would help you get rid of them when you needed to. It has most frequently been played, though, in Mud decks, which in a lot of ways are more recent versions of Stacks decks. Mud decks get their name from running a bunch of old-school artifacts with their brown, mud-like border. They don't run Smokestack, but they do run taxing artifacts like Thorn of Amethyst and Sphere of Resistance. Combining those with Tangle Wire is pretty nasty, as it will make your opponent unable to do anything while you continue to add to the board, and once again, you have ways to sacrifice the artifacts once they aren't doing their job. Tangle Wire is still seeing plenty of play in Vintage today, and obviously it has a very strong hold on the #1 spot on this list. Well, those are the 10 cards with Fading or Vanishing that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, you can find direct links to the Card Kingdom store for each of them in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it as much as you can, as the more people who see it, the better. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on previous MTG Top 10s, including others that look at mechanics and keyword abilities, you'll see some playlists on your screen shortly. Finally, if you enjoy my content on this channel, consider subscribing to my other channel, Need to Hone History, where I talk about real-world history. Thanks for watching.